Hi, I'm Mara Cherkasky, a historian with Prologue DC and co-director of the Digital Public History Project Mapping Segregation in Washington, D.C. One of our consistent grant sponsors has been the Military Road School Preservation Trust, and as part of the project, we researched the history of the Military Road School and the land it sits on, as well as the community around it. This PowerPoint was presented to the Military Road School Preservation Trust in April 2017. But is being recorded in April 2021. Here's the school today at 1375 Missouri Avenue. It used to be called Military Road. The Military Road School once was a centerpiece of an African American community in Brightwood that predated the school and the neighborhood. Long before the Civil War, at least 5 large properties belonged to free African American families. These 5. At least one family was already there by 1837. The Shamwell family, which in fact is still in the area. We know that Georgia Avenue, then known as the 7th Street Turnpike, was paved as far back as 1818, and a village grew up around the crossroads of Milkhouse Ford Road and the Turnpike. On this 1859 map, you can also see there was a toll gate and a church, Emory Chapel, which dated to 1832. Milkhouse Ford Road later became Rock Creek Ford Road, and now it's just a few blocks long, running west of Georgia Avenue. So we knew about the community. It comprised both black and white families, and we also knew from the Military Road School Preservation Trust that the Military Road School dated to the Civil War. During the war, Union troops built fortifications all around the city, and one was Fort Stevens in Brightwood. This 1863 map also shows property belonging to the free black Butler and Savoy families. Camp Brightwood was the original name for Fort Stevens, and contraband were African Americans who'd run away from slavery. Many found shelter, work, and safety at Union forts, including here in the district. African American communities grew up or expanded around the forts. Much has been written about Fort Stevens and the battle that was fought there in July 1864, so this presentation is not going to address it further. This 1871 map shows the Military Road School in relation to Fort Stevens. Looking at this 1894 map, we see little black squares indicating buildings. 3 of them are schools. None are named. Here's a 1919 map with the 3 schools. We know that one of them is the old Brightwood School. It's labeled. It was later torn down and rebuilt south of Missouri Avenue. We also know that one is the Military Road School because it's still there. What's this other school, though? It's not labeled on any map, and it's long gone. We finally figured out the story. It's important to know that until 1871, this whole part of the District of Columbia was governed separately from the city of Washington. Today's Ward 4 was part of Washington County. In fact, the entire area north of Florida Avenue was Washington County. Before 1862, there was no provision for public schools for African American children in the district. There were schools, but they were established and run privately by benefactors, churches, and others. Children paid a fee to attend. After emancipation in April 1862, philanthropic groups established a number of schools. Legislation in 1862 and refined in 1864 provided for public schools for African American children in Washington, Georgetown, and the county. But very few opened, often due to the hostility of white residents or landowners. The legislation established 8 county school districts. 2 schools would be built in each, one for white children and one for African American. Congress authorized the funds for this in 1866. Districts 1 and 2 were west of Rock Creek. Brightwood was in District 3. District 4 was around the Soldiers' Home. Districts 7 and 8 were east of the Anacostia River. The District 3 colored school first opened in a Fort Stevens barracks in early May 1866 with 8 pupils, 2 boys and 6 girls. A teacher was hired, Harvey Smith. The school commissioner was directed to buy land to build 2 dedicated schoolhouses. He was able to purchase 1 acre from Wilson King for the white school, as you see on this surveyor's map. Military Road, which would later run here, would cut this acre off from the rest of King's land. This road here is today's Colorado Avenue. Here's the school's location on the 1873 map. So that was the white school. The county school commissioners had trouble finding a white property owner or any property owner to sell a piece of land for the African American school. So they forced the Butler sisters to sell a half-acre lot for $100, plus $10.96 for a second piece of Butler land needed to provide access to the school. The deed says the payment was based on a per acre rate of $135. Here in the red rectangle are Sarah Butler Matthews and Elizabeth Butler Savoy on the 1881 map. The 2 schools, which are circled in black, were built close together, the upper one for African American children and the lower one for white children. We're talking 1 or 2 room schools with a wood stove and an outhouse. The African American school had an average attendance of 30 the first couple of years, although more than twice as many school-aged children lived in District 3. For the 1866-67 school year, the pay for male teachers in white schools was $720. That's annual. For female teachers in white schools, $540, and for teachers in colored schools, $510. In 1886, the white children got a new schoolhouse here. Their old building was turned over to the color division, and the existing colored school became known as the Annex. The grades were split between the 2 buildings, so that's why there are 3 schools on the map. Here's the white Brightwood School, and here's the African American Military Road School about 1900. We haven't found any pictures of the Annex. In 1912, the Military Road School was replaced with a brick building, the one that still stands. The 2 old frame buildings were torn down. Now we'll talk about Brightwood's African American community. As I said, at least 5 large properties were owned by African American families going back to the 1830s. Here are some of the family names from an 1887 map. By now the Shamwells, whose roots in the area date to 1837, have sold some of their land. Here's Greenidge, Reynolds, Matthews, and Elizabeth Thomas, whose roots here reach to 1842. You can see there's 1 house on each lot. Fort Stevens is also marked. The schools, and Emory Chapel, later Emory United Methodist Church. It was recently converted to housing. On the 1903 map, we see more land has been subdivided. Elizabeth Thomas's land is marked unrecorded subdivision. There are houses on Fort Stevens. Brightwood School shows up. And St. Luke's Baptist Church is at the corner of Brightwood, now Georgia Avenue, and Shepherd Road, now Missouri Avenue. One of the anchors of Brightwood's African American community was St. Luke's Baptist. The Military Road School Preservation Trust still calls it the Military Road School Church. Organized in 1879, it met for 2 years at the home of Solomon Kemp on Bates Road in the small racially mixed Woodburn community near Fort Totten. It drew members from that community and also from the Fort Stevens community. Frank Greenidge was one of the founders, in fact. It was led by Reverend Shelton Miller from 1879 until his death in 1931. The first St. Luke's building was on Shepherd Road, but we haven't found the exact location yet. In 1890, the congregation needed more space, so it bought land in the spot indicated on this map and built a new church in 1892. It was designed by the prominent African-American architect Calvin Brent. Here's the church in the same location on this 1919 map, way in the lower right-hand corner. However, the city needed the land to reconfigure Missouri Avenue, so St. Luke's had to move in 1928 to a lot near 14th and Peabody Streets at the left. This was Reynolds' land. Remember, that was one of the early African-American families, and Reverend Shelton Miller was the Reynolds trustee. His name is on this large tract. Here's the church in 1948. Descendants of the African-American families sold off their land starting in the 1920s. Some of them developed portions of it and sold or rented the houses. The next set of maps shows how the community changed. Here's the 1919 map again, and a picture of 10-year-old Earl Shamwell, whose father built their house in 1910. The lot is circled. He used a well-known black architect, Roscoe Vaughan. The picture was taken in 1920. For the buildings shown on the map, pink means brick and yellow means wood frame, so you can see that in 1919 all the residential buildings were wood frame. Emory Church was made of stone, which is indicated by brown. In the 1930s and 40s, a number of whites-only apartment buildings and complexes were built on and around the old African-American community. This 1937 map shows the brick Concord Garden Apartments at 13th and Missouri. For a while, Missouri Avenue was called Concord Avenue, the address listed in the ad. The map also shows that Fort Stevens has become a park, and there's a new street configuration around it. By 1945, the area has changed drastically. Almost all the land between 13th and 14th Streets, 13th and 14th, is large apartment buildings, including the Fort View Apartments, built in 1939, and Rolling Terrace, built in 1941. Here are ads for those buildings. Just west, the 1400 blocks remain more or less the same. This is one of the old houses along Rock Creek Ford Road about 1950. And a bigger view of it. It's another view. Here's a view of that same block. But that area changed soon, as you can see on this 1954 map. An apartment building went up on the site of the original African-American schoolhouse. The image shows it under construction in 1948. Although these properties were not restricted to whites by covenants, they were in fact open only to whites. The Federal Housing Administration, along with the real estate and banking industries, enforced segregation. Real estate records show that the Greenidge family owned their property until 1949, but by that time the original property had dwindled. In this slide, I've overlaid the 1881 map on the 1937 map. It's not perfect at all, but I hope you can see that Fort Stevens Drive, Fort Stevens and Fort Stevens Drive, took some of the Greenidge land and also a big chunk of the other area that had been the African-American community. In 1960, St. Luke's was still on the map, but it moved that year to Colorado Avenue and then to 1415 Gallatin Street, where it remains. The only vestige of Brightwood's historic African American community today is the Shamwell's 1910 house, tucked in among the red brick apartment buildings along Fort Stevens Drive. And of course, the Military Road School. Thank you for your interest in our project.